for the entire session will be Dr. Shiv Kumar from Broadband India Forum, assisted by Mr. Adit Sharma. It also gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Renuka Rameshan and Mr. Saurav Roy Chaudhary, who are our sign language interpreters. And as you may be aware, in our drive to promote accessibility in the digital communications world, we at the Broadband India Forum had introduced sign language interpreters for all our webinars. And I think that we are possibly one of the very few such think tanks who does this. And it's a privilege to have both Renuka and Saurabh here today. Dr. Renuka Rameshan is the president of the Association of Sign Language Interpreters of India and holds a PhD in social work. She is a senior sign language interpreter and trainer with an experience of 20 years in the field. Currently, she is also an executive member of the ISLRTC, which is the Indian Sign Language Research and Training Center. Mr. Saurabh Chaudhary is a member of the Association of Sign Language Interpreters of India and is a freelance sign language interpreter. He has done his master's in extension and development studies and is proficient in English, Hindi, Bangla, and the Indian Sign Language and American Sign Language as well. I know that each and every one of you are very used to being on a virtual platform, but it behoves me to make a few small housekeeping announcements before we start the session. All speakers are requested to please keep their mics on mute if they are not speaking. During the question and answer session, the moderator will determine the opportunity to invite you to speak. At that point, obviously, you will switch on your mic. Keeping your camera on is a matter of personal choice and convenience, except if you are speaking, it's always nice to see the visual face as well. This event is being recorded and being streamed live on YouTube, and the link will be shared with all the participants to revisit and share with your colleagues and friends as you wish. Please use the chat window down at the bottom for any questions, and they will be taken up by the moderator at that particular point of time. With that out of the way, now let me invite our president, Mr. T.V. Ramachandran, for his welcome note and introductory remarks. TV is actually needs no real introduction. He is an esteemed industry veteran and has been part of the telephony sector in India since its very inception. As the first CEO of Sterling Cellular, Delhi, and then having established and led COAI for 12 years. He's a recipient of the Voice and Data Lifetime Contribution Award for his mobile telephony in India. He is also an honorary fellow of IET London and IETE India. TV, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you also for carbon dating me, almost. Fossilized stage. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to heartily welcome a close friend of many years and the chief guest for today's event, Dr. Rajat Kathuria, Dean of School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nada University, and visiting Professor ICRIA, and is very well known as one of the moving forces behind TRAI for many years. I knew him there from 1997 or 1998. So he is a very well-known person in the field, extremely knowledgeable and extremely articulate in his views. So it would be a pleasure to have him as a chief guest here. We also heartily welcome Mr. Sunil Abraham, Public Policy Director at Meta, Professor Saikat Datta, Visiting Fellow at Observer Research Foundation, and Ms. Amrita Chowdhury, Director, CCAOI, all other colleagues from the industry, members, associates of the Broadband India Forum, media, friends, other distinguished ladies and gentlemen. A great Ram Navami to you all, and a very warm welcome once again to this digital dialogue, which is being held for the release of a very well curated report prepared by ex-KDR, who has been introduced by Rajat, a very reputed policy and regulatory think tank on revising the IT Act 2000, Information Technology Act 2000. Coming on the close on the heels of ongoing pre-consultation, which the ministry has launched prior to release of the draft act, we hope that this report would be useful and provide suitable strategic pointers to the policy and decision makers as they go about shaping the contours of the upcoming Digital India Act. The government recently announced that it will introduce a Digital India Act, a new IT law, and it will replace the well-known IT Act of 2000, which was a milestone in its own way. But time has passed by and everything needs to be updated and modernized. And the first pre-consultation held recently in Bangalore, which I had the distinction to attend, was chaired by Honorable Minister of State for Electronics and IT, Shri Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who made a brilliant presentation at this meeting and laid out the government's draft outline and approach for the upcoming policy. And it very nicely sought inputs from the stakeholders around those pointers that were laid out by the Honorable Minister. We at BIF, of course, intend to provide our written submissions on a number of areas, which will include aspects of internet inclusivity for the differently enabled and elderly persons. And when we talk inclusivity, accessibility, BIF believes in putting action where the words are. And like you see, we have our, almost invariably every conference, we have our sign language interpreters. We have a specialist committee which deals with this. We've got very renowned members in that. We also intend to provide inputs to the government for the draft act on aspects of internet governance, to which BIF is very seriously committed. All aspects of internet governance, including resilience, trust, and cyber security. We'll also be talking about aspects of technology neutrality and enhanced liberalization through lower entry barriers and light touch regulation. The minister himself stated that they would not be favoring the adoption of prescriptive actions or regulation. We laud this heartily and add that whatever regulation, light touch or otherwise, may kindly be thought of in an ex-post manner rather than ex-ante manner, whatever little regulation we want. We would also like to seek clarity as regards oversight of certain areas on which there seems to be some confusion in some quarters. The oversight of OTT under DIA, which we believe is already under the purview or ambit of the MeitY and IT Act, and consideration for whatever additional regulation desired to be under the same act. The industry is all for considering modernizing and suitable regulation, but we plead that to avoid confusion, let it be considered under the same IT Act. We'll cooperate fully on that. We also seek clarity as regards oversight of IoT and importance of keeping safe harbor provisions. Enforcement is very important, but equally or more important, we believe are the retention of decriminalization provisions, bringing in and retention. We also want to see the importance of interconnect exchanges and keeping them license exempt. We have a long way to go in terms of creating adequate numbers of interconnect exchanges, and we are fully committed to cooperate on suitable policies for that. Last but not least, we would wish to emphasize the importance of adequate bandwidth into and out of the country, increased diversity and enhanced competition of supply, most important. Also critical would be the delinking of undersea cable networks from the cable landing network. These are all some of the points on which we want to give inputs to the government for the draft act, and they, in their wisdom, will hopefully consider some of these things. I do not wish to take up more time because XKDR has done a great job. They've gone into great depths. We have less words for them. I mean, no words are enough for the amount of work, iterations that have been done, discussions, clarifications, and they have come out with what we believe is a very good paper on covering certain aspects of what need to be looked at in the new act. So I will not take up more time on that, leave you all to listen to the key highlights of the report, which is now going to be released by one of the authors who is here with us, Mr. Rishabh Bailey from XKDR. He is there before you. After the report is officially released by our chief guest, Dr. Rajat Kathuria. This shall also be followed by a vibrant panel discussion between several eminent panelists who will happen to be great subject matter experts. Thank you for this patient hearing, and I hope you all have a very interesting and useful time with the release of this paper. Back to you, Rajat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, TV, for your introductory comments and laying it out so clearly. It is my privilege now to welcome Dr. Rajat Kathuria, our chief guest today. Dr. Rajat Kathuria is presently the Dean at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at the Shiv Nadar University. He served as Director and Chief Executive at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, more commonly known as ICRIER, before joining the university in April of 2021. He has almost 25 years of experience in teaching and more than 15 years of experience in practicing economic policy, besides research interests on a range of issues relating to regulation and competition policy. He has worked with the World Bank, Washington, as a consultant and carried out research assignments for a number of international organizations, including the ILO, UNCTAD, LearnAsia, the World Bank, and ADB. He has published in international and national journals, besides in popular magazines and newspapers. He's an undergraduate degree in economics from St. Stephen's College, a master's from the Delhi School of Economics, and a PhD degree from the University of Maryland in College Park. Rajat, it's a privilege to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. And may I now request Arun Mukherjee to please release the paper.
Many thanks to our chief guest, Dr. Rajat Kathuria, Dean, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and Professor Economics at the Shiv Nadar University, for releasing a BIF Commission study on Revising the Information Technology Act 2000, which has been prepared by XKDR, a research and knowledge-based forum which is providing recommendations for the revision of certain key sections of the proposed new Digital India Act. We would also like to thank Professor Ajay Shah, Mr. Saikat Datta, and Mr. Nandkumar Sarvade for valuable discussions and insights. Highlights of the report will be presented by Mr. Rishabh Bailey, Senior Consultant ex-KDR, after the release of the study report.
Thank you very much, Arun. With that, may I hand over to Rishabh to take the discussions forward. Rishabh, will you be moderating the panel discussion as well?
Yes. Thank you so much. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the release of our report on the amendment of the IT Act. In particular, I'd like to, of course, thank Debashish and his team at the BIF for making this report and event possible. Without further ado, I'd like to jump into a quick overview of our report. As has already been mentioned, and as everyone is no doubt aware, the IT Act, which was enacted in 2000 as a comprehensive law to regulate e-commerce, electronic documents, and safety in the digital ecosystem, is today seen as outdated. The proliferation of the internet and the development of a range of new digital technologies over the last decade has raised a number of questions concerning the development of the digital sphere, and in particular about the role to be played by the government and private sector players in enhancing trust in the digital ecosystem. The government has, over the last few months, indicated that it's planning to replace the IT Act with a new Digital India Act as part of a broader package of laws concerning the digital ecosystem. To this end, the Minister of State for Electronics and IT a couple of weeks ago conducted a pre-consultation outlining some of the principles and concepts that will go into the new act, and has indicated that there will be public consultations on the design of the new law. Through our report, we attempt to contribute to this process of amendment of the IT Act framework. In our report, we aim to evaluate 4 critical issues that are covered by the IT Act. We examine what the main problems are with the current law, and based on literature review and an examination of international best practice, suggest changes to the legal framework. The issues we selected for study are first, censorship or content blocking by the state, as covered under Section 69A of the IT Act, intermediary liability, that is Section 79 of the IT Act, surveillance, which is permitted through Section 69, 69B, and 67C of the Act, which relates to data retention, and finally, an issue that's not often spoken about in the context of the IT Act, but is nevertheless really important, that of cybersecurity. So we look at how the IT Act prescribes various offenses, as well as establishes an institutional framework to deal with cybersecurity concerns. Today, I'll provide a brief overview of our findings in the report. Of course, due to the paucity of time, I'll not be able to take you through all the issues involved under each of the 4 topics, but will instead focus on highlighting some of the major pain points as well as recommendations. I'll begin with the issue of censorship under Section 69 and the rules framed thereunder. Now, this provision in the IT Act basically gives the government the power to block access to content on various grounds mentioned in Article 19(2) of the Constitution. However, it's interesting to actually note that the provision doesn't actually permit content to be blocked on grounds of decency and morality, something that is worth noting as separate routes, for instance, under rules promulgated under Section 79, have been used to censor such content. Rules issued in 2009 lay down the process for blocking content. In short, on receiving a request for blocking content, a designated officer is required to make all reasonable efforts to identify the person or intermediary who has hosted the impugned information, issue a notice to them to appear before a committee of examiners, and present their case opposing the proposed blocking. After scrutiny by the committee of examiners, the decision is forwarded to the secretary to the Department of IT, who makes a final call on the matter. All blocking decisions are subsequently looked at by a review committee established under the Telegraph Rules, which comprises 3 top-level bureaucrats. Some of the problems with the current process are that both the Committee of Examiners and Review Committee lack any sort of transparency and accountability. For instance, there's no information available on the processes followed by the Review Committee or any public record on when the Review Committee meets or its deliberations. Further, there's a clear absence of capacity to scrutinize the substantial number of blocking requests. So for instance, in 2010, there were 9 such requests, which increased to around 7,000 in 2021. Therefore, it's unclear whether there is any actual application of mind or indeed whether due process in terms of providing hearings to the content creator are actually followed. Another problem with the blocking process is that when access to content is blocked, there is no requirement for the government to notify the concerned content creator or owner. This obviously creates problems in terms of limiting the redress avenues for the content creator. In fact, very often Rule 16 of the rules, which mandates confidentiality of blocking processes, is used to restrict access to the reasons for blocking content, making any recourse difficult. Accordingly, we suggest first, reducing the scope of powers under the parent provision. Blocking shouldn't be permitted merely because it's expedient to do so. It must be necessary and proportionate, which also implies no mass blocking orders. Each instance of blocking must be accompanied by reasons. Second, ensuring a neutral, independent quasi-judicial body to oversee blocking requests. Third, there must be greater transparency in the entire censorship process. And finally, there is need to ensure that processes for unblocking content are also clarified. Moving on to the issue, slightly trickier, of intermediary liability. Now, currently, Section 79 of the Act attempts to extend the position of distributors having immunity for content onto the internet. Accordingly, Section 79 offers immunity from prosecution to intermediaries if they act as passive distributors of content, disable access to illegal content upon receiving actual knowledge thereof, and if they comply with various due diligence obligations. This due diligence route, of course, has become the favored way to introduce a host of new obligations on a range of intermediaries. So the 2021 and 2022 IT rules lay down various requirements, such as the need to take down a broad range of content, to assist law enforcement, to proactively screen for illegal content, to trace originators of information on messaging services, and to establish grievance redress processes. Of course, it is problematic to tie liability for user content to a range of completely unconnected obligations that are not even contemplated by the parent statute. We find that the current legal framework, particularly as prescribed by the IT rules, encourages disproportionate censorship, surveillance without adequate safeguards, and an absence of principles of natural justice in content moderation processes. We therefore recommend, first, retaining the broad system of safe harbor. The principle that a person should not be held responsible for what they do not intentionally do is something that must form the bedrock of the law. Further, holding intermediaries responsible for user content implies that there's likely to be more and more privatized censorship, something intermediaries are not always well placed to do. However, this doesn't mean intermediaries such as platforms should not be liable for, say, ensuring user safety or being more transparent in the use of algorithms for content moderation and so on. We therefore argue that separate obligations and punishments should be imposed on them outside the intermediary framework. These should be proportionate and based on the type of harm occasioned, so segregating obligations, say, by the size of the intermediary concerned could be one possible option. Further, we believe that the framework established by the 2021 and 2022 IT rules needs to be re-examined insofar as they enable extremely broad and arbitrary censorship, the breaking of end-to-end encryption by requiring traceability, and so on. Coming to the issue of surveillance. Currently, Section 69 and rules thereunder provide the power and processes for interception and monitoring of online communications. The framework envisages a system of executive authorization and then oversight by the review committee established under the Telegraph rules. Section 79 is, however, very broad. For instance, it goes beyond the much older Telegraph Act in permitting surveillance without the test of a public emergency or public safety being threatened. This power can also be used when expedient and not just when necessary. As is the case with blocking of content, the oversight mechanisms are also limited. The review committee has to deal with a large number of cases and so can't adequately apply its mind to each. Again, there's a lack of transparency and accountability of this body, as I mentioned previously. Separately, we also have a number of mass surveillance programs, such as the centralized monitoring system, which isn't authorized by legislation and functions with virtually no oversight. Accordingly, our primary recommendation, in line with previous attempts at legislating on this issue, is to have a separate surveillance-related law with multiple levels of oversight. Such a law could harmonize surveillance practices and lay down best practices for states. We've also seen similar frameworks in jurisdictions such as the UK and Australia. In the alternative, the IT Act itself could be amended to narrow the scope of powers under Section 69, 69B, and 67C by reducing the scope of arbitrary action and ensuring statutory safeguards. Some of the safeguards that could be implemented include prior judicial review, legislative oversight, and even the barring of illegally acquired evidence, thereby incentivizing law enforcement to follow proper processes. Finally, surveillance outside the scope of the Act must be prohibited and a legal basis provided for programs such as the CMS, assuming, of course, that they are continued. Coming to the issue of cybersecurity. The IT Act currently defines phrases such as cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and so on, and prescribes a variety of offenses such as unauthorizedly accessing computer systems. It also establishes the Office of CERT-In as the nodal agency to deal with cybersecurity incident reporting and response, as well as the NCIIPC, the agency supposed to protect critical information infrastructure. However, we find that while the offenses in the Act are more or less in line with international best practice, the provisions are not always clear on the possible defenses that could be adopted, say in the context of ethical hacking. There are also significant problems with the institutional design in terms of the scope of functions and coordination mechanisms of the two bodies established under the Act. We argue that CERT enjoys excessive and ambiguous delegated powers, which can be problematic, as we've seen in the case of the cybersecurity directions introduced last year. Not only are the directions under challenge in the Delhi High Court, they don't appear to have actually worked very well. Very few entities, for instance, have reported incidents within the time limits prescribed by these directions. So we therefore recommend that the institutional frameworks established under the IT Act should be revised to clarify the role and powers of CERT-In and the NCIIPC. In particular, their rule-making powers need to be clarified. The law should also ideally avoid duplicating functions of each agency. We also argue that imposing mandatory incident reporting requirements across the board is disproportionate and imposes unnecessary costs on the ecosystem. Reporting requirements should therefore be limited to large and systemically important systems and entities. This is something that we've also seen in multiple foreign jurisdictions. Finally, the statute itself should lay down mechanisms to enable coordination between cybersecurity agencies, sectoral regulators, and other relevant authorities. With that, I'd now like to hand back over to Mr. Rajat Mukherjee as we move on to the next component of today's event. Thank you.
Rishabh, thank you so much for that. And let me first start by apologizing that to both you as well as to each and every one of the group on this discussion today that I omitted to actually introduce you, Rishabh. So better late than never. Having heard his erudite presentation, Rishabh Bailey is a lawyer and a technology policy researcher. His research interests include platform regulation, data governance, telecommunications, digital rights, and regulation of emerging technologies. And we are in the throes of that right now. Previously, he worked with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, and has also worked with various civil society organizations where he advised on technology and rights-based issues. Rishabh, my apologies for not having introduced you prior to the start of the discussion. With that now out of the way, may I request you to take the panel discussion forward? I think it will be best suited for you to introduce the panelists as well. Over to you, Rishabh.
Thank you, Rajat, and for that very, very kind introduction. I'm delighted, of course, that we're joined today by three of the leading technology policy experts in India today, Sunil Abraham, Amrita Chaudhary, and Saikat Datta. Sunil Abraham is the Public Policy Director for Data and Emerging Technology at Meta. He's had a long career as an analyst of Indian technology policy, having co-founded the Center for Internet and Society in 2008. Sunil has also been a professor at Artes University of Arts in the Netherlands and has been an Ashoka Fellow. He's also currently chair of the BIS Internet Content Applications and Governance Committee. Amrita Chaudhary is the director of the Cyber Cafes Association of India. She's been an active member and contributor at national, regional, and global internet governance platforms, and is currently a UN IGF MAG member, as well as president of the Internet Society India. She's one of the founding members of INSIG and a coordination committee member of the India IGF. She also advises youth initiatives such as Youth IGF India. Our final speaker, Saikat, is the founder and CEO of DeepStrat, a think tank and consultancy based in New Delhi, which conducts research, advocacy, and leadership interventions. He's had over 2 decades of experience as an award-winning journalist and strategic communicator, and has co-authored a book on India's special operations capabilities called India's Special Forces, The History and Future of Special Forces. His research papers on India's intelligence and counterterrorism capabilities have also been widely cited around the world. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your views on the issues raised in our report, as well as the Digital India Act more generally. Now, in terms of the format for the discussion, for the first half an hour or so, I'll ask the panelists certain questions. Following this and subject to time, we can then take some questions from the audience. I'd like to remind the audience to put their questions in the chat box where I'll pick them up from. And of course, it would be great if you could mention if your questions are directed at any specific panelist. With that, I'd like to sort of kick off our discussion today, maybe with a question to Amrita. Focusing on the issue of intermediary liability, which of course is one of the more critical issues that is likely to be taken up in the Digital India Act. Now, the concept of safe harbor was initially introduced when the digital ecosystem was in its infancy and was supposed to incentivize platforms to self-regulate. This appears, however, not to have worked as well as intended. Platforms are also increasingly curating user experiences through algorithms and so on. In this context, is it actually time to reconsider safe harbor? Is this still required in today's digital ecosystem? And in the alternative, does an understanding of what constitutes actual knowledge need expansion from what the Supreme Court laid down in the Shreya Singhal case? Amrita, your thoughts?
Just before Amrita starts, I'm so sorry. Rishabh, I'll request you to speak a little slower, please.
Sure. My bad. Sorry, I will.
Thank you so much, Rishabh and BIF, for having me here. Disclaimer, I am not an expert. I just share views, which I think, over the years I have acquired. So coming to your question, safe harbor is required, I would still say now. Though the digital ecosystem is dynamic and there are various attributes which are coming in, platforms may also be publishing, but they are also intermediaries. If we remove the safe harbor, then there is a chance that they will start censoring content. What I am writing would then be subjected, since Sunil is here, I will use the example of Meta. Meta would be deciding whether my content is legit or not. So where does freedom of expression go? Where does the rights of people go? Do we want platforms to have that kind of power to decide what will be published and what will not be published? That gives a chilling effect. We need to have the platforms maintain that intermediary part of their function. Now, they should be ruled or governed based upon the functions they have. So if you ask me, it is important the safe harbor be there. It is important that the intermediaries, when they are functioning as intermediaries, be an intermediary and allow content to flow freely, because that has helped to empower people. Else, we would be, most of the content would not be there. What is right for some may be wrong for some. Likewise, there are certain rules they have to follow, but I don't think we should go that path, not at this point of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita. If I could maybe bounce that off Sunil as well, particularly given the sort of curating role that platforms are playing in terms of curating news feeds, etc., etc. What are your thoughts on continuing safe harbor for all intermediaries?
I think without safe harbor, thanks for the question, Rishabh. Without safe harbor, many of the things that are possible on the internet today, and this is not just social media intermediaries, but even non-profit projects like Wikipedia would not be possible at all. So it is core to the possibilities of the internet that you have safe harbor, but more and more, I think all stakeholders are in agreement that safe harbor is conditional, and what those due diligence obligations should be is being debated across the world. And in India, we have a tradition of being on the bleeding edge of regulatory theory and practices. Some of the debates that you hear in India, for example, around digital public infrastructure, or India's approach to the open banking problematic is completely different from what you would see in other countries. So more recently, when the government introduced the GAC as an oversight mechanism to a certain due diligence obligation that falls upon the shoulders of intermediaries, a question might arise, is that the right thing to do, or is that in opposition with alternative models such as self-regulation and co-regulation? And the answer is a complex one, which is given how complex the ecosystem modern information societies are, you need them all. You need self-regulation, and then you also need co-regulation, and then you also need government oversight on co-regulation. So I think the government has done the right thing by establishing the GAC, by establishing a layer of oversight. It has absolutely done the right thing by having consultation with intermediaries when it comes to the design of the GAC. They have made it quite clear that there will be a test period, and then the codification of the practices would only be done after the efficacy of these practices have been tested. And then going back to the point about being on the bleeding edge of regulation, this is also an example of online dispute resolution and the use of RegTech. So in many ways, it's a very interesting case study on how you can bring all these worlds together. So I don't think the Indian government is choosing between competing paradigms, but actually embracing them all. And that's indeed interesting.
Thanks, Sunil. Saikat, any thoughts on the continuation of safe harbor as a general paradigm as we move into the next 20, 30 years?
I think, first of all, congratulations. That's an excellent report that XKDR and you have authored. So, and also thanks to BIF for supporting this and having us here. I don't have much to add to what Amrita and Sunil has already said, but the general principle of safe harbor also needs to be looked at in terms of new technologies which are coming in. And primarily you will see technologies which will be looking at posting content or creating a space where content can be shared in different forms and so on. Now these, as Sunil and Amrita have already explained, offer a lot of challenges, both in terms of regulation as well as in terms of what innovators would want to do. So therefore, general principle would be that we should not strike down things because we have to protect innovation, but at the same time also protect users. And personally, I would think that the government should have as soft a touch as possible, because when the government comes in, they'll also have to look at constitutional norms, because safe harbor is also in many other laws and principles, constitutional principles like freedom of speech and so on and so forth. So keeping that complexity in mind is where how you envisage safe harbor.
Thanks. Saikat, I'd like to stick with you for the next question, if I may, on the issue of surveillance, something, of course, you've done a significant amount of work on. Now, the oversight systems that we currently have with respect to surveillance are clearly insufficient. So what systems can actually be put in place to ensure democratic accountability? For instance, the Digital India Act will apparently implement an adjudicatory mechanism for online offenses. So can there be a similar dedicated judicial oversight of surveillance? Is this workable both from a practical perspective as well as given, say, the experience of, say, the FISA courts in the US, which have been criticized as largely acting as a rubber stamp for the executive? How would you see oversight over surveillance practices?
Thank you, Rishabh. That's a very interesting question. And I've gone through the recommendations and particularly the chapter that you have put together. And again, some very good recommendations have come out from your study. You see, to look at surveillance, it's a much bigger problem than what we look at it merely in terms of, within the purview of the IT Act or the proposed DIA Act. First of all, I mean, we have to give kudos where it is deserved, and that is kudos to the government for imagining and starting a process to create a Digital India Act. For the simple reason, the world has changed tremendously. It's much more complex, and much more complexities have to be recognized and thought through before they are regulated. And therefore, it's a great initiative that the government has undertaken. And it's not going to be an easy task. It will be very challenging. When it comes to surveillance, it's a much bigger issue because we've also seen how technology has impacted surveillance. It has made not only gathering data on citizens easier, it's also created a situation where big data can be analyzed much faster. As a result, even if people say that, oh, it's okay if you just collect metadata, that too could be hugely problematic and impinge on a lot of constitutional guarantees. For the simple reason, there are now mechanisms and tools available which can create a lot of quick big data analysis and lead to a lot of harms. The other thing is that in India, we have to also understand that surveillance is a much bigger problem because the agencies which are empowered to carry out surveillance, they are not regulated. They have not been enacted as an act of parliament. So therefore, what is their charter? What is the transparency? What is the scrutiny? That element gets completely forgotten when we have these discussions. Second is, if you look at what allows for surveillance, there is one particular issue which is called maintenance of public order, and there is also for commission or of a crime, so on and so forth. Now, these, unless they are narrowly defined, me wanting to just speak somewhere could very easily be considered as a reason for surveillance, which is otherwise guaranteed under Article 19(1). So therefore, thinking through that, what are the harms and where does it ultimately lead India's democracy towards? Because we are in the world's largest democracy. If you want to continue remaining a democracy, then we have to recognize that there are a lot of harms that can come, both economic harms as well as rights, etc., from a surveillance perspective. But we also have to recognize, and you've hinted this and you mentioned this also in your presentation, we also have to recognize the state has certain legitimate needs for national integrity, security, etc. I would want that the DIA recognizes and also encodes that within the act, because you see, when the popular perception is, no, these are things that can't be spoken about in a law. I think they must be spoken of in a law. As a result, it will also create certain kind of gold standards on what can be done and what can't be done, what are legitimate reasons, and therefore how to implement it. And when it comes to judicial oversight, not only should surveillance have judicial oversight, and actually the FISA courts have not failed, for the simple reason FISA courts is for foreign surveillance. Within the territorial boundaries of America, much more laws and much more interference actually and oversight when it comes to American citizens, which Indian citizens sadly don't have today. They need to have a higher set of rights as far as I believe. And therefore, not only should we have judicial oversight, but also parliamentary oversight. And we could look at the British laws to look at how this can be.
Thanks, Saikat. Sunil, I'll just take that to you, if I may. One of the methods of preventing overreach of law enforcement is to introduce frictions in the data collection processes. However, in India, we see that law enforcement commonly complains of how intermediaries are not very responsive, despite having huge amounts of data on users. How do you see this sort of role that intermediaries play then in the entire surveillance process?
Sorry, I still didn't understand your question, Rishabh. What exactly are you hoping that I will answer? I mean,
just in terms of one,
Saikat has covered what a good surveillance regime looks like, and he has outlined a set of principles. What were you hoping I would say?
I was hoping that you could speak to the role that intermediaries play in either creating friction in the surveillance process, since surveillance requests very often have to go through an intermediary where it's not directly, say, a centralized monitoring system kind of situation. And what are the sort of safeguards that can be implemented at that level? I mean,
yeah, I think I would sort of respectfully protest against that question. I think where that question is coming from is that the intermediary has some role in resisting the government's attempt to govern an information society. I think the best way to answer that question is to go back to what Saikat said. And one way to frame it is to quote the Minister of State Rajiv Chandrasekhar. When he was talking about the DPDP, he said that in many other contexts, they see this as a dichotomy, that that you can either have innovation or you can have the protection of user rights. And what he said is, in India, he was trying to maximize three completely different policy objectives. This false dichotomy to begin with. So he was maximizing for user rights and maximizing for the protection of innovation, and also maximizing for preserving the government's capacity for governance. This is not easy to do either in the law or to build technological systems where we solve this triple maximization challenge. But I think India has traditionally approached this in the right fashion. If I go back to your question on friction and technical measure that has to be taken to introduce friction, I think the question comes with a sort of homogenization tendency. And that is what I would say we should resist. What safety looks like is very different on different platforms. What privacy looks like also is very different in different platforms. So the approach that the Indian government has taken, and it's sort of in the DNA of the IT Act from the 2008 amendment, and I connect it always to my favorite German academic, Gunther Teubner, and his proposal for reflexive regulation. So rather than spelling out a lot of detail, the Indian government uses a reflexive mechanism, and that is the reasonable person standard. So even for a conversation like this, when it comes to accessibility law has the concept of reasonable accommodation. In Section 43A of the IT Act Amendment from 2008, there was reasonable security measures. In the 2002 amendment to the IT rules, when it comes to Section 31B, there is this requirement of taking reasonable efforts when it comes to doing proactive content regulation. So you can see that core to the Indian approach to governance is this principle of reflexive regulation. And that approach, I think, sort of points out that the solution that you're pointing towards, which is private actors taking the regulatory question into their own hands by introducing friction, that wouldn't really be necessary, because whatever their actions are, they would be judged post facto against this reasonable person test.
Thanks, Sunil. I'll take that to Amrita now. Amrita, of course, the government is also considering passing a data protection law, but some have criticized that, saying that it doesn't cast enough fetters on the government itself. In this context, how do you see, practically speaking, how do you push towards a general surveillance law reform, as also suggested by the Justice Sri Krishna Committee? I mean, we've had many previous members, private members' bills also, which have been suggested but haven't gone through. Any thoughts on the issue of surveillance reform in general?
Sorry, so you are asking me about surveillance reforms, right? Okay. So I think Saikat eloquently, shared the outline of what's happening and what is not. I think From a user perspective, it is important if there are surveillance laws, there has to be oversight mechanism, there has to be an accountability, and there has to be transparency. Today, we know all kinds of data if we look at India geopolitically, there is a need for some sort of surveillance. Not all surveillance is bad, but there is a thin line, and that line is crossed a lot of time. And so I think, one, we need a data protection regulation so that the rights of people are protected, because today all kinds of data about us is gathered and used. We don't know how it is used. So I think for surveillance laws to come in, there has to be oversight, there has to be transparency, there has to be accountability. I should somehow know how my data is used, even if it is by the state. And what are the protective mechanisms I have? If my rights have been abused, where do I go to? Nowadays, because national security is something which we cannot question, there has to be some definition somewhere.
Ever expanding definition almost.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to actually now segue into the issue of cybersecurity and direct my question to Saikat. Now, given the multiple failures that we've seen in the cybersecurity space in the recent past, I mean, we've had the problem at AIIMS, for instance, very recently. We've had nuclear power plants sort of being hacked. What are the immediate changes required in our institutional system? So, for instance, do we need multiple entities such as the NCIIPC and the CERT-In dealing with the issue of cybersecurity?
Frankly, I think if you look at the whole alphabet soup, I think we have a combination of so many alphabets that if you add a few more alphabets and create again a new organization with a new permutation combination, I don't think that will solve the problem. It will just add more people with very limited charter and even smaller budgets trying to tackle a gargantuan problem. And I'll also draw a relationship between cybersecurity and surveillance. Like, we all understand that cybersecurity is based on three principles: confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information when you need it. Most of the time, our cybersecurity frameworks looks at confidentiality and it looks at availability. More often than not, we end up ignoring the integrity part. As a result, what's happening is we are now building databases after databases, both at the central level and at the state level. Just to give you an example, we had the Aadhaar framework. Now suddenly government of Haryana said, on basis of that, we need a Parivar Pehchan Patra, a family ID, which will also be connected to your electricity bill and so on and so forth. Even university admissions will need a Pehchan Patra, etc. So you are now duplicating so many databases. Ultimately, when it comes to the integrity of the data, now people will get confused that what we are protecting and we consider to be one safe database, which one is it and to whom? As a result, integrity is out of the question. Therefore, confidentiality and availability just fall there and there. Instead of too many, I think the institutions that we have are adequate. We need to give them more budgets. We need to also enforce greater accountability on them. So if I am DG X or DG Y, Director General of X or Y, then there should be an accountability in that role, because without accountability, you will never be able to get anything. And on that, what I would also suggest, and this accountability has to be at various levels and made very clear, which, like, if you look at 70 and 70B, we have delineated critical information infrastructure from non-critical, but a lot of powers have been given under 70B, which NCIIPC does not have. So how do you expect them to then not only identify, they are a nodal agency for critical information infrastructure, but they're also supposed to notify and protect, but don't have any laws backing them to actually take real action. So these anomalies will have to be worked out and ensure that there is data minimization, because if you have less data, then you have less data to lose. So therefore, data minimization as well as usability of the data should be minimized as far as possible.
Thanks. Amrita, coming to the issue of the 2022 certain directions, many have said that they disproportionately affect smaller organizations who don't impose a similar risk on the system as larger critical infrastructure institutions could. Should reporting requirements therefore only be restricted to those organizations that are really big or that have a material impact on the entire internet system as such?
Thanks, Rishabh. When the certain directives had come into effect, or when it was proposed, we had concerns. Primarily, what the objective the directives want to meet vis-a-vis what the requirements are they proportionate? So it's been more than 6-8 months since the directives have come into force. Perhaps a review of how it has worked needs to be done. Any fair process should have that kind of a review, what's worked, what's not, and perhaps taking a step back and seeing what can be tweaked is important. That's one part of it. The second part of it is, yes, the requirements for a small and medium player is much more. A bigger entity or a bigger company can actually, they have their infrastructure, they have their cybersecurity practices, or at least they are enhancing it in place. So for them, reporting is, I would say, much more easier. It's not easier, but it is much more easier for them to report. That's one part. However, there is another part. Because cybersecurity is becoming a threat to even small and medium players. Anyone can be attacked. In that way, it is important that the smaller players also invest in their cybersecurity upgradation, which many times do not happen. So they need to enhance their cybersecurity capability, and perhaps some kind of reporting, if not that stringent, is not bad. Because if you look at the cybersecurity attacks which are happening, and I'll just take the example of SolarWind. SolarWind is a big company, but if you look at it, it was the SolarWind which was attacked, which, their systems were infiltrated. From it spread to the others. So you don't know, and these smaller entities may also be linked to bigger companies. So you don't know where the vulnerability comes from. So it is important everyone is protected. However, should smaller players also have that kind of requirements? That needs a review. I think the certain directives, how it's worked, needs a review. And perhaps if the government wants everyone to report the way it does, and certain is justified asking for reports because people do not report it, perhaps the government should think of how to support these smaller entities in enhancing their capability. And I also think, with my limited understanding, certain also needs to enhance their capability in terms of manpower, in terms of what all they can do. So I think some review is important of what worked, what didn't work, and then take action. Thanks.
Thanks, Amrita. I'd now like to sort of jump back again to the sort of intermediary and censorship issue with a more general question to Sunil, which is that we're seeing the imposition of more and more obligations of different sorts on intermediaries in multiple jurisdictions. So, the UK is contemplating an online safety bill. There's lots of legislation being debated in the US and so on. So are these fears that have been, mentioned for more than a decade now of balkanization of the internet actually being realized? We've also now, of course, seen apps being banned purely based on country of origin, for instance. Your thoughts on, are we seeing more and more balkanization of the internet? You're on mute, I think, Sunil.
Apologies, Rishabh. So I think the first thing to make clear is when it comes to certain types of responsibility, such as deciding what is the truth and what is not the truth, what kind of speech should be censored, what kind of speech should be allowed on platforms. Intermediaries and the industry broadly has become less and less hostile when it comes to new regulation. It is clear to us, as it is clear to many other stakeholders, that often regulation is motivated by the need to protect the rights of users. Now, regulations can come in all sorts of forms, and some of the regulation, a subset of them, as you rightly have pointed out, can have balkanization impact on the internet. And it goes back to the point that Gunther Teubner made, which is law is an autopoietic system. So the law begets more law, and that tendency of begetting more law is going to just add to the complexity of the engineering task at hand. And this is where I want to connect the question that you posed to me to the question that you've posed to Amrita and Saikat, which is the more complexity there is from a regulatory obligation perspective, the more complexity there will be in the products built by different stakeholders, and that's usually a terrible idea from a cybersecurity perspective. And while it does make sense to have some type of classification, you can't take that classification temptation too far, because it then adds to this complexity issue. It results in balkanization happening within a jurisdiction. So within a single jurisdiction, an intermediary might have to choose between two conflicting obligations from two separate regulators. So we run into all those kinds of problems as well. So ideally, as many speakers have said already, the regulation has to be at the level of a principle, and the regulation ideally should have tests, as I have outlined before, such as the reasonable person test. But the actual nitty-gritty of technical implementation, that should be left to more bottom-up processes, where the industry itself can come up with what they think will or will not work. And that can be debated and critiqued by different stakeholders. So if we don't do it that way, then as you rightly pointed out, we are going to end up with incredibly balkanized and complicated internet.
Thanks, Sunil. And that actually leads me on to my next question to Saikat, which is, I mean, Sunil spoke about the complexity in law, but some people have criticized principle-based laws in general as leading to more ambiguity in their application. Particularly, we've heard a lot of this in the context of the drafting of the privacy law in India, for instance. We've also seen how, say, previous versions of the privacy law leave a lot of room for the executive to play around with obligations. How do you see the design of the Digital India Act in this context? I mean, would you prefer a more prescriptive legislation or a more principle-based legislation, which might, however, leave more room for executive discretion?
I would suggest a principle that generally there should be less and less discretion left generally in any law. That is the principle I would like to adhere to. Because the whole idea of law is to bring a certain degree of rules, standards, and commonality, which is the essence of rule of law. But if you end up having a lot of discriminatory powers in one segment, then the whole idea of having a law defeats itself. Because you see, moment you leave it there, and we tend to see it in narrow perspectives based on our ideologies or on who we politically support, etc. But the function of democracy is governments will change. The rules that one government is setting will start ruining it the day they are out of power, and another government is in power will use the same rules and use it in a much more damaging manner and create much more havoc. As a result, the implications are businesses will suffer, the Indian economy will suffer, Indian integrity will suffer, and Indian progress for India will suffer. So if I am keen about India emerging as the most powerful economy in the next 20, 30 years, as the hub for the next level of innovation, etc., then the one principle I would want to put in place is that less and less discrimination to any stakeholder within the framework of our constitution.
Great. So that sort of leads me to my final round of questions, and this is for all our panelists. Just in terms of what are the top couple of priorities for you to see, or issues that you should see covered, and how should they be covered in the new Digital India Act? Do you have a sort of top couple in your bucket list or wish list? Amrita, should we start with you?
Thanks. As in, the wish list is long, but the government as objective is commendable to open, safe, and trusted, accountable internet. So I think the first thing is bringing regulatory clarity, such as create, as in your report, as you mentioned, some distinction of the different classes of intermediaries, perhaps update the cybercrime paradigm to cope with the new forms of cyber threats, perhaps have a light touch regulation for the emerging technology so that it can thrive, some kind of an oversight or accountability mechanism which is transparent over the state, because over the years we've seen many regulations which gives sweeping powers to the state, the rights of users to be protected, and obviously harmonization between the different regulations, sectoral or otherwise, which is coming in. For example, we now see a turf war going on. Sorry for me using the turf war. TRAI saying there should be a convergence between different kind of regulations under one umbrella, which is difficult, which is impossible looking at how complex this entire thing is. Even sectoral, departments are not being able to cope with it. So I think there has to be harmonization between the different rules coming up. We need to be cautious before we bring in new rules. And as Sunil mentioned, there has to be some tests done before we deep dive. And my biggest wish list for this regulation to come in is involving all stakeholders properly in the consultation, so that we can come up with something which serves us for some more time, because this landscape is changing, ever evolving. We can't have rules just for today, and we should not have rules only for big companies, as in regulation should only not be for big tech. Regulation is for everyone. So it should take that into consideration, which sometimes we miss that thought. Thanks.
Thanks, Amrita. Sunil, any thoughts on your general sort of wish list for the Digital India Act?
Yeah, so just to repeat some things I've said, the first, of course, is non-technical, technically non-prescriptive law, so that different providers can innovate in different ways when it comes to provisioning integrity on their platforms. And then to sort of connect to what Saikat said to the previous question, so the uncertainty produced by principle-based law, the regulatory uncertainty, ideally, and I completely agree with Saikat, it shouldn't be filled with executive discretion. It should be filled with self-regulation and co-regulation. So that's how that uncertainty must be completed. That would be my second request. And then, as the Minister of State argued, I thought rather well, that we should try and maximize for everything. Protection of user rights, the promotion of innovation, and the preservation of the capacity for governance, of course, with the proportionality and necessity tests and all the other constitutional tests. That's it from me. Thanks, Rishabh.
Thanks. Saikat, final thoughts on the design of the Digital India Act?
Very quickly, the government is at a historic juncture, and if they get the act right, it will be remembered for generations, not just years, but for generations, and actually set India on the next higher level. So within that, two principles. One is that if we are able to take care of innovation and protect innovation, because without innovation in this knowledge and technology economy, etc., we cannot progress. So innovation has to be protected, which could mean various forms of light touch and a lot of regulatory certainty, which is very important. The other is if we are able to reform some of our major problems like surveillance, etc. And the argument here is, if you look at any totalitarian regime or regime which has progressed towards totalitarianism, they have always failed. Economically and politically, they have failed. So by giving or reforming our surveillance laws, etc., through the DIA, we will be in a position to also align with the march towards prosperity for India and reach much higher levels with great innovation.
Great. Thank you so much, Saikat. for that. And of course, Amrita and Sunil as well. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. I've certainly got many ideas for my submission for the consultation processes for the Digital India Act. And I hope most of the audience here will also be able to engage with these processes as we go forward. As Amrita pointed out, I think it's really important that the general community is also a part of this consultation process. And with that, I'd like to thank all our panelists once again and hand back to Mr. Rajat Mukherjee to take this forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rishabh. I will be doing the duties in place of Mr. Rajat Mukherjee, who just stepped out for some personal reasons. So first of all, let me thank the moderator, Mr. Rishabh Bailey, as well as all the panelists, which is Mr. Sunil Abraham, Ms. Amrita Chaudhary, and Mr. Saikat Datta, for a very vibrant and a very interesting panel discussion, which laid down certain thoughts, gave us some clear ideas as to what should be the constituents of the forthcoming Digital India Act, and at least has given us a lot of food for thought and material, which we as BIF, as a knowledge-based think tank, would like to propose maybe in our submissions to the government. So thank you all for this excellent inputs that have come out of this panel discussion. So we now move on to the next part of our program. And I have now the pleasure of inviting our chief guest for this occasion, which is Dr. Rajat Kathuria, to deliver his keynote address. So with this few words, I believe Dr. Rajat has already been introduced earlier. So without wasting much time, I would now hand over the floor to Dr. Rajat Kathuria to deliver his keynote address. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you so much. And at the outset, let me thank my dear friend, TV, for giving me this honor of inviting me as chief guest to this report release, which has been a fascinating discussion so far. Rajat Mukherjee, distinguished members of the panel, Sunil, Saikat, Amrita, and of course, Rishabh, very sort of skillfully, I think, moderated the panel discussion. And all colleagues from industry, members and associates of Broadband India Forum, members from the media, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, let me say that this has been a most fascinating discussion. And at the end, I will say a few things which came to my mind as I was listening to the panel discussion. But let me just say that it's been a tremendous honor for me to be invited here as chief guest. As always, TV has been very gracious, and quite undeservedly, he has invited me to release this excellent report, which has been diligently prepared by XKDR on a subject which I think is of great contemporary interest and one of the significant importance as we try and become a $1 trillion economy in the internet and digital space. I have no doubt that we will become. The question is whether we can do it by 2025, and hopefully we can if proper legislation is put in place. It is axiomatic that legislation is unable to keep up with the dynamism of technology. And this is, this has been a theme in the discussion so far, that such a dynamic sector like digital and telecommunications and cyber, the regulation should be sort of future ready. The digital landscape in India in 23, what we see today, and if you sort of go back in history, is a fair cry from what it was when even the IT Act was introduced in 2000. The purpose behind the introduction of the IT Act was to create an enabling environment for digital transaction and e-commerce. And if you look at the perspective at that time, Google was only 2 years old. Amazon was still solely selling books, and Netflix was still a DVD rental service. Additionally, only a handful of what are now some of India's most valued startups were founded the same year. When new business models emerge, they test the limits of existing governance frameworks. The IT Act was last amended in 2008 to deal with the challenges raised by the digital world, while also ensuring that innovation remained relatively unfettered. This is what Sunil said that the Minister of State had said we should maximize innovation, we should enable privacy, and we should maximize the ability of the government to regulate or to govern. This sounds like in what in economics we call the Trinity, and sometimes the Trinity, you cannot simultaneously achieve all the objectives, but hopefully in the IT, in the digital space, maybe we will not have to compromise too many of these objectives to get the whole in place. The 2008 amendment introduced criminal provisions for online speech, provisions to guard against cyber terrorism, and clarifying language around the perimeter of safe harbor for intermediaries under Section 79. The IT Act 2000, as I said, was last amended in 2008, and therefore does not adequately account for technological developments that have taken place over the last 14 years. Certain provisions of the IT Act are at odds with emerging technology, rendering some use cases illegal and denying their benefits to society. Now, digital services may be incompatible. The new services that are emerging may be incompatible with existing definition, creating roadblocks for enforcement and business uncertainty. All this is not good for innovation. Examples of this include online gaming, the metaverse, autonomous cars, all that have been suggested to be technologies of economic significance. A new IT law is therefore needed to plug the gaps in the existing IT Act 2000. In the 14 years since, technological innovation pushed the digital realm to become a more pervasive presence in the social, political, and economic lives of not only Indians, but people all over the world. Everything seems to be digital these days. Moreover, the complexity of the digital world and humanity's engagement with it has increased exponentially. Emerging technical paradigms such as online gaming, the metaverse, the artificial intelligence, that we are seeing are bringing their own sets of challenges, but at the same time, opportunities for all of us. The following gaps that have been pointed out by the panel already in the IT Act 2000 prevent it from accounting for these developments that are now taking place in the digital space. Emerging technology is at odds with existing provisions and rendering certain technological use cases illegal and potentially denying society the benefits of the same. For example, Schedule 1 of the IT Act 2000 lists certain documents to which the Act shall not apply, such as wills and contracts for the sale of immovable property. Consequently, it disallows the use of digital signatures, which form a core component of blockchain technology in such transactions. Thus, it is necessary for the new framework to enable such use cases by creating a mechanism for recognition. So this is just one of the illustrations that the new Act needs to account for. New digital activities can be incompatible with existing legal definitions, creating roadblocks for enforcement and also creating business uncertainty. Legislation defines business models or instruments in a static way, right? And limiting its purview to focus on business models that exist at the time of enactment. Resultantly, there can be uncertainty around the governance of newer technologies, particularly in terms of jurisdictional responsibilities. And a governance vacuum sets the stage for ad hoc interventions, which can lead to suboptimal outcomes for both consumers and the industry. And the panelists have eloquently discussed what if you don't have a law, then discretion can creep in, and discretion can be both damaging for industry, it can be damaging for consumers as well. While you don't want to be prescriptive, you also want to minimize the level of discrimination or discretion at the hands of enforcement agencies. And in India, we recognize that fairly well. So what is the roadmap for a future-ready digital India Act? One can always ask as to why should the Digital India Act be future-ready? To overcome gaps in the IT Act 2000, the Digital India Act must be future-ready. That is to accommodate any digital service offering activity that might be invented in times to come. The path to a future-ready digital act involves the introduction of a mechanism to recognize new technological construct. Such a mechanism is key to ensuring that dynamism of technology industry is not with odds at the state's ability to enforce. Put another way, a recognition mechanism will make it difficult for newer business models to evade legal obligations. Concomitantly, it will clarify that digital businesses are under the purview of the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, giving the former much needed certainty. Other jurisdictions are also focusing on making their laws and regulations future ready to deal with the unpredictability of technological evolution. For instance, the preamble to the proposed EU regulation of markets in crypto assets expressly states that the framework must be future-proof to be able to keep pace with innovation and technological developments. The idea of future readiness has been considered also in the academic literature. There is a whole host of academic literature on this topic. Thus, in the future, the law should never cover any sale of goods online, regardless of who or what the seller is, or what technology is being used to facilitate the transaction. A product function focused Digital India Act must include a catch-all phrase for the activity that takes place online or through electronic transmission. Digital undertaking, the term coined for this purpose, would cover any online activity. It is defined as the use of any electronic means to generate, facilitate, or enable any form of electronic transmission. The broadness of the term may raise concerns about the inclusion of entities that may engage with digital technologies, however fleeting engagement that might be. However, that is also the purpose, namely that no activity online should go uncovered to limit the chances of activities carried out through the future technological paradigms evading the oversight of the Digital India Act. Thus, basically, and I completely agree with what the panel said, one has to create a balance. And the balance has to be between what was said of maximizing innovation, enabling privacy, and not ousting the role of the government, or not saying that the government has no role to play. The government has a role to play in enabling and facilitating intelligent and proportionate legislation. Let me now just briefly say something which struck me as particularly important in the discussion that was happening. And this is at a meta level, and this could be an opportunity for future discussion as well. This relates to India's sort of opportunities to engage in the digital space outside its borders. Now, the question that is often raised in the production of knowledge, and in this case, the production of digital knowledge, the production of digital innovation, is that whether there is a universal approach to this. Can there be a universal acceptable knowledge? Is that an absolute? Can we have the universalization of the internet? Just like we had the universalization of, let's say, knowledge in science and technology space. Can there be a universal knowledge? And increasingly what is happening today, given the discussion around the balkanization of the net, or given the discussions around, I would say, the hegemonies of certain countries, the colonial tendencies of certain countries, the colonial tendencies of certain powers, can that universalism of knowledge be applied in the current context, especially as it relates to the digital space, when you have Russia, China on the one side, and you have United States and Europe on the other side? So what does it mean to be universal? What does it mean to be an absolute digital standards? What do they mean in the context of the current environment, especially for the global south and especially for emerging markets like India? This, I know, is not a subject that is covered under the current topic, but I think it's an interesting area to try and discuss, especially as it relates to India's sort of G20, and what India's role will be in this space, especially in setting standards for the rest of the world in the years to come. So thank you once again, TV and the Broadband India Forum, for inviting me to be chief guest. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And I hope and I congratulate everybody who's been involved in the preparation of this excellent report. And I wish that it gets a lot more traction and discussion in government before they come out with their Digital India Act. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajat Kathuria. Thank you very much for that excellent talk and address, and then giving us directions as to what are the so-called milestones that we expect to see in the forthcoming Digital India Act, and how we can make the act together collaboratively between all stakeholders, including the government, to ensure that this act becomes a kind of a benchmark and kind of takes into account the future needs that the technologies and sector would be looking forward to, and how it can regulate the future technologies which are emerging in the digital space, at the same time ensuring that there are no hard regulations which are imposed upon the sector. Thank you very much for the food for thought as to what are the other areas, new areas that we should take into account, which will give BIF in particular and other stakeholders some kind of a food for thought for them to mull upon as when they are making their submissions to the government on the forthcoming act. Thank you once again, sir. Couldn't thank you enough. I also now come to the last part of our program today, wherein I have the pleasure and privilege to deliver a vote of thanks to everyone who has participated in this event. So my name is Debashish Bhattacharya. I'm Senior DDG at Broadband India Forum. I shall make a short vote of thanks because I know it's quite late. We are almost close to lunchtime. So let me at the outset take this opportunity to first thank our chief guest, Dr. Rajat Kathuria. Thank you very much, sir, for that very erudite talk and address. I'd also take this opportunity to thank our partners, ex-KDR, Mr. Rishabh Bailey, and his a set of co-authors who have written this excellent report on the revisions in the IT Act. Thank you so much. And of course, the support that you have received also from other colleagues like Professor Ajay Shah, Mr. Sarvate, as well as Mr. Saikat Datta, who also happens to be one of our distinguished panelists in the very invigorating and vibrant panel discussion that was moderated by you. So I also wish at this point of time to take the opportunity to thank our three panelists, which is Mr. Sunil Abraham from Meta, Ms. Amrita Chowdhury from CCAOI, and Mr. Saikat Datta from Deep Strat for their excellent thoughts and discussions which happened during the panel. Thank you all for this excellent talk. I also wish to take this opportunity to thank Broadband India Forum, our president, Mr. TV Ramachandran. Thank you very much, sir, for not only delivering the welcome address and setting the context, but also sort of giving us the encouragement and the guidance to have these kind of more and more sessions and to have more knowledge-based reports on various acts and various aspects of the knowledge economy. Thank you so much, sir. I'd also take this opportunity to thank our Director General, Mr. Rajat Mukherjee, who introduced the session to all of us. Unfortunately, he had to step out for some personal reasons. I also wish to take this opportunity to thank our colleagues from the Institute of Sign Language Interpreters, Dr. Renuka Rameshan, thank you very much, and Mr. Saurav Rai Chaudhary for having taken the trouble to actually do this inclusive connectivity to all sections of this industry and society. Thank you so much, very much. And last but not the least, I would like to thank colleagues in our BIF directorate who have worked day and night to make this event a successful one. With these few words, I would now, and of course, all BIF members, those who have been a part of this discussion, as well as those who have given us the encouragement to actually do this event, I would like to thank each and every one of you for having joined today, as well as those who have been unable to join but have been behind this particular event. Thank you all very much. And with these few words, I would now like to bring this event to a close and wish everyone a very nice and a happy day. Thank you very much, all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Renuka. Thank you so much.